11:14 a.m. local time. Strait of Hormuz. USS Porter, carving a steady line through one of the most strategically volatile waterways on Earth. On the surface, nothing appeared abnormal. Commercial tankers maintained assigned corridors. Wooden fishing dhows drifted lazily in loose arcs. Small coastal craft weaved between them in patterns so common they barely registered as background noise. The destroyer's radar display was crowded, but routine. 20, 30, sometimes 50 small contacts inside 5 nautical miles was standard traffic in these waters. At 11:14:32, routine dissolved. Multiple small vessels accelerating, bearing 091, range 800 meters. The voice inside Combat Information Center remained controlled. It always did. USS Porter, an Arleigh Burke-class guided missile destroyer, had been executing freedom of navigation patrols for 6 days straight. Aegis Combat System active. AN/SPY-1D radar cycling with disciplined precision. Phalanx close-in weapon systems on standby. On board, 140 sailors and 80 Marines assigned specifically for ship security and anti-boarding response. They had drilled for this scenario countless times. They had simply never watched it compress this quickly. At 11:15:04, 12 wooden fishing boats that had been idling at low throttle surged forward without warning. Their bows lifted, wakes sharpened into white lines cutting directly toward the destroyer's port and starboard sides. Behind them, 10 low silhouette fast attack craft broke loose and accelerated hard, engines howling. This was not navigational confusion, it was vector alignment. General quarters, all hands man your battle stations. Alarm tones echoed through steel passageways. Watertight doors slammed shut. Sailors abandoned maintenance tasks and sprinted toward assigned stations. Marines moved in controlled formation toward pre-designated deck sectors. Rifles chambered mid-stride. Range, 600 meters. Closing time, under 60 seconds. At 11:15:38, the lead fishing boat crossed inside 300 meters. No radio hail, no deviation, only speed. Hostile intent confirmed, weapons free. The forward Phalanx CIWS rotated smoothly. Target lock established. The 20mm Gatling system spun up, its mechanical growl rising into a continuous metallic roar as rounds streaked across open water. One fast attack craft shattered under direct impact, fiberglass hull erupting into flame and spray. But the fishing boats were already inside the defensive envelope. At 11:16:02, 3 of them struck the destroyer's hull almost simultaneously. Grappling hooks arced upward. Steel rang against railings. Rope ladders dropped. From beneath tarps and false decking, 50 Iranian Revolutionary Guard Commandos emerged, rifles firing as they climbed. They had hidden among nets and fuel fumes for nearly 20 minutes. Now they moved with drilled efficiency. 2 Marines on the weather deck were hit in the first volley. One dropped immediately. The second crawled behind equipment cover, returning measured fire. Boarders port side, multiple climbers. At 11:16:27, the first Iranian commando cleared the rail. He landed firing. Others followed within seconds. The engagement collapsed into close quarters violence. No long-range intercepts. No missile exchanges. Just steel decks, 30 yards, sometimes 5. The Iranian concept was straightforward. Overwhelm topside defenders, force the bridge, breach engineering spaces, declare control before reinforcement could materialize. Shock, velocity, narrative impact. But one assumption had failed. USS Porter was not undefended. By 11:17, internal containment protocols were fully activated. Blast doors sealed reactor access. Bridge entry locked behind reinforced steel. Engineering control transferred to redundant internal command nodes. Even if the outer deck was contested, the destroyer could not be commandeered. On the weather deck, Captain Elena Mitchell received the updated assessment. Estimated 40 to 50 hostiles topside. Her response was level. Seal all primary access routes. Bridge stays locked. Marines hold positions. We do not lose this ship. By 11:18, Iranian commandos occupied sections of the exposed outer deck. They had achieved physical presence. Casualties had been inflicted. Smoke drifted from small arms impacts and minor surface fires. But they had not taken command. They had not reached propulsion. They had not seized navigation. Below decks, 60 Marines maneuvered through internal corridors, preparing to push upward in coordinated counter-assault. Outside, surviving Iranian fast attack boats circled aggressively, firing intermittent suppressive bursts to restrict defender movement along exposed rails. In less than 3 minutes, the Strait of Hormuz had shifted from routine patrol corridor to active boarding battlefield. 48 kilometers to the north, USS Bataan had already received the distress transmission. The countdown had begun. 26 minutes. At 11:19:12, the counteraction initiated. Below the deck plates, Marines stacked tightly at an internal ladder well. "On my mark," the platoon leader said quietly. Above them, Iranian commandos advanced toward the bridge corridor, convinced momentum remained on their side. They were mistaken. The destroyer was contested, not captured, and the response was already unfolding. 11:19:34 local time. Inside the narrow passageways beneath the weather deck, the acoustics changed. Gunfire overhead echoed as muted metallic thuds. Boots struck ladder rungs. Controlled breathing filled Kevlar helmets. Safety selectors clicked off. 60 U.S. Marines moved in 2 disciplined assault elements through the central spine of USS Porter. Their objective was not revenge. It was vertical dominance. Topside, roughly 50 Iranian fighters held fragmented positions along the outer decks. They had created disruption, but not control. Some attempted to breach toward the bridge using cutting torches and shaped charges. Others delivered suppressive fire toward exposed defensive points. But the destroyer's defensive doctrine had already sealed its vital arteries. The battle was no longer about surprise. It was about structure, and structure was on the side of the ship. But the destroyer's defensive doctrine had already sealed its vital systems. Reactor space, secured and isolated. Engineering control transferred to redundant internal stations. Bridge access hardened, locked, reinforced. Even with sections of the weather deck contested, propulsion and navigation were untouchable. At 11:20:02, the 1st Marine Counter-Assault Team reached Ladder Well 3, directly beneath the primary bridge corridor. Stack. 4 Marines aligned in silence. 1 forward, 3 behind. Carbines up. Angles assigned. Topside. Iranian borders were oriented outward, toward railings, toward suppressing visible defenders, toward maintaining the illusion of control. They did not anticipate vertical resistance. At 11:20:19, the hatch burst open. The lead Marine emerged low and left, firing 2 precise shots into silhouettes 12 feet away. Both attackers collapsed instantly. The 2nd Marine pivoted right, engaging a 3rd who had barely turned his rifle toward the ladder opening. 4 seconds, 3 boarders down. The geometry shifted. "Counterattack!" a voice shouted in Farsi. But the deck offered no maneuver room. Railings, lifeboat mounts, cable reels, and superstructure angles created confined kill zones. Marine teams advanced by bounds, 2 firing, 2 moving, never clustering, always maintaining overlapping sectors. No improvisation. Drill. At 11:21, a 2nd internal hatch opened along the aft port quadrant. Another Marine element surged out behind a cluster of Iranian fighters, attempting to breach a sealed access door. They were caught between converging fire arcs. 5 dropped in seconds. The boarding force had expected dominance from above. Instead, they were being squeezed. Outside the hull, 8 surviving fast attack boats repositioned aggressively, firing sporadic bursts toward visible Marine movement. The objective was obvious: keep pressure on deck defenders. Buy time for the remaining boarders to reach command spaces. They were unaware that reinforcement was already airborne. At 11:21:48, 48 kilometers north, USS Bataan had launched its response. 8 MV-22B Ospreys lifted in rapid sequence, each loaded with 30 Marines in full combat gear. Their rotors hammered the air as they accelerated south at more than 240 knots. 4 AH-1Z Viper attack helicopters followed, armed with AGM-114 Hellfire missiles, 70mm rockets, and 20mm cannons. Time to arrival, approximately 12 minutes. Back aboard Porter, the fight compressed further. At 11:22:03, an Iranian fighter detonated a fragmentation grenade along the port rail. 2 Marines were wounded, one critically, but the blast failed to compromise structure. Smoke thickened, visibility narrowed. Engagement distances shrank to under 10 yards. An Iranian element made one final surge toward the bridge corridor, dragging portable cutting tools and using suppressive bursts from an external fast boat to mask their movement. They closed within 15 feet of the sealed bridge door. Inside, Commander Mitchell stood with 20 armed sailors, sidearms drawn, emergency shotguns staged. If the hatch failed, the fight would be immediate and terminal. At 11:22:41, the internal Marine element struck again. From behind, the Iranian team never completed the breach. 3 fell instantly. 2 attempted to withdraw along the starboard walkway and were cut down by intersecting fire. By 11:23, active boarders had dropped from roughly 50 to 32. The deck remained contested, but no longer fluid. Several Iranian fighters established a defensive pocket behind deck equipment, delivering controlled bursts to stall Marine advance. The engagement had shifted from shock to attrition. At 11:23:27, one fast attack boat closed inside 200 meters and launched a short rocket volley. The projectiles struck short, detonating against the waterline and sending concussive shock through the hull. Close enough to matter, Porter's aft phalanx system rotated automatically and opened fire. The 20mm stream tore across the approaching boat. The hull shattered under impact. The vessel ignited and capsized within seconds. 7 external boats remained. On deck, remaining boarders consolidated midship, attempting to form a defensive core. They were no longer advancing. They were holding. At 11:24:10, the updated status reached the bridge. Bridge secure, engineering secure, boarders contained midship. Captain Mitchell responded without raising her voice. Compress them. The Marines did not rush. They narrowed the perimeter. At 11:24:38, suppressive fire pinned the Iranian pocket, while 2 Marine elements maneuvered along opposite flanks of the superstructure, eliminating escape lanes. 4 more boarders fell. One attempted to leap over the rail toward a fishing vessel still hooked to the hull. He was engaged mid-air. North of the horizon, inbound aircraft signatures began to appear faintly on radar. Reinforcement was 8 minutes out. On deck, active Iranian fighters dropped below 25. They had achieved surprise. They had inflicted casualties, but they had not achieved control. 11:24:52 local time. The deck now belonged to the clock. 25 boarders remained, split into 2 shrinking pockets, midship starboard and aft port near the lashed fishing boats. Marine fire teams moved methodically, clearing angles, controlling ladder wells, denying vertical escape. Hold port element. Starboard advance 5 meters. Maintain crossfire. Every command was measured. At 11:25:11, an Iranian fighter attempted to deploy another grenade toward an advancing Marine stack. He was engaged mid-throw. The grenade detonated at his own position. 2 additional boarders fell in the blast. The perimeter tightened. At 11:25:40, 3 Marines executed a controlled push along the starboard bulkhead, forcing the midship pocket to split. Iranian fighters attempted to regroup behind a deck-mounted crane assembly. They were met with converging fire from 2 angles. Another 4 were eliminated. Outside, the remaining fast attack boats began to waver under persistent suppressive fire from deck-mounted .50 caliber machine guns. They circled wider now, uncertain, exposed. At 11:26:03, the first AH-1Z Viper crossed into visual range. Seconds later, its fire control system locked. 2 Hellfire missiles launched in tight succession toward the nearest fast attack boat cluster. The first boat erupted in flame. The second disintegrated seconds later. Panic rippled across the remaining vessels. On deck, the psychological axis shifted visibly. Iranian boarders were no longer maneuvering. They were firing from cover and attempting to survive. At 11:26:28, the first MV-22 Osprey appeared overhead. Then another. 8 in total, descending in disciplined formation. The roar of rotors drowned out gunfire for a moment. 50 Iranian boarders had begun the assault. By the time the first Osprey hovered over the destroyer, fewer than 15 remained active. At 11:27:10, fast rope lines dropped. 30 Marines per aircraft descended in controlled succession, boots striking steel deck within seconds of one another. Reinforcement did not arrive gradually, it arrived decisively. The ratio shifted instantly. What had been a contested deck became an overwhelming counter-assault. Marine elements integrated seamlessly, original defenders merging with fresh reinforcements. At 11:28:02, the final organized Iranian pocket attempted a last push toward the port rail. They were met with overwhelming fire. Within 90 seconds, organized resistance ended. By 11:29:30, only isolated shots remained. At 11:31, the final Iranian commando was engaged and neutralized near the aft railing. The boarding force had ceased to exist. At 11:41 a.m., 26 minutes after the first grappling hook struck steel, USS Porter was fully secured. All 50 Iranian commandos eliminated. All hostile boats destroyed or disabled. Bridge secure, engineering secure, reactor secure. 220 Americans accounted for. The destroyer remained operational. The attempt had been bold, the response had been structured, and in 26 minutes, structure prevailed. They were no longer advancing, they were cornered. At 11:32:14, a Marine fire team shifted left, closing the final lateral gap. Another element advanced from aft, rifles steady, spacing disciplined. The remaining boarders attempted sporadic bursts to create movement space. It bought them nothing. At 11:32:28, one Iranian fighter rose from cover and fired a short burst toward the advancing line. He was engaged from two angles simultaneously. He collapsed before completing his second trigger pull. 5 remained. Above them, the thunder of MV-22 rotors faded as the last reinforcement wave cleared the deck. 2 AH-1Z Vipers maintained overwatch, orbiting low enough for their presence to be unmistakable. There would be no escape. At 11:32:51, one commando attempted to climb the starboard rail, possibly intending to leap into the water. He was engaged mid-motion and fell back across the deck plates. 4 remained. Marine squad leaders adjusted again. Advance 2 meters, hold, overwatch maintain. The circle tightened. At 11:33:07, 2 Iranian fighters attempted a synchronized push toward the ladder well access, likely hoping to force close quarters confusion. They were met with controlled, intersecting fire. Both dropped within 3 seconds. 2 remained. The deck was now silent between bursts. Smoke drifted low across the superstructure. Burning debris from destroyed support craft flickered beyond the hull. At 11:33:26, the final 2 commandos positioned themselves back-to-back behind a deck-mounted equipment rack. One fired a final controlled volley toward the nearest Marine element. Return fire was immediate. 1 fell. The last fighter remained upright for less than 5 seconds. At 11:33:41, the final Iranian boarder was neutralized. There was no cheer, no exhale, only confirmation. Deck clear. At 11:34:02, Marine elements began systematic clearance of every exposed sector, checking behind lifeboat mounts, beneath deck overhangs, inside open lockers, confirming no remaining threats. By 11:35, the destroyer was fully secured. All 50 Iranian boarders were dead. All hostile small craft had been destroyed or disabled. Bridge intact. Engineering intact. Reactor secure. Combat systems operational. Damage control teams continued working through minor fires and fragmentation, scoring along the port side. Medical personnel moved among the wounded. Casualty counts were recorded with sober precision. The ship had been struck, but it had not been taken. At 11:36, Captain Mitchell received confirmation from USS Baton that all reinforcements were accounted for and air cover remained on station. She issued a single directive: maintain posture, resume defensive formation. The Strait of Hormuz returned to an uneasy quiet, broken only by the hiss of extinguished flames and the distant churn of recovery boats retrieving debris. 26 minutes earlier, grappling hooks had struck steel. 50 Iranian commandos had believed speed and surprise would seize a U.S. destroyer in international waters. They had achieved proximity. They had inflicted casualties. They had created chaos. But they had not seized propulsion. They had not seized navigation. They had not seized command. At 11:40 a.m., USS Porter adjusted course slightly and continued her patrol. No distress flags, no retreat, no tow required. The boarding attempt had lasted 26 minutes. The response had lasted exactly as long as necessary. The destroyer remained operational. The strait remained contested. And the lesson was unambiguous. Surprise can place boots on steel. Structure decides who keeps the ship. They were holding ground they could not keep. At 11:32:22, the 4th and 5th MV-22 Ospreys stabilized over pre-cleared sectors of USS Porter's deck. Fast ropes dropped instantly. Marines descended in disciplined sequence, boots striking steel in under 10 seconds. Within half a minute, total Marine presence aboard the destroyer exceeded 240 personnel. The ratio was no longer tactical. It was decisive. At 11:32:41, one Iranian fighter attempted to arm a grenade while retreating toward the starboard rail. He was engaged before completing the motion. The grenade never left his hand. 5 remained. Advance by bounds, no rush, cleared deliberately. The tone over internal comms did not change. It never had. At 11:33:18, coordinated pressure from port and starboard elements collapsed the final defensive pocket. 2 commandos were neutralized in intersecting fire. A third was incapacitated while attempting to descend a rope ladder toward a burning fishing vessel still tethered to the hull. 4 remained. Smoke from destroyed boats drifted low across the water, black columns rising above scattered debris. Flaming fragments floated in widening circles around the destroyer's wake. The Strait of Hormuz was no longer traffic. It was a controlled battle space. At 11:34:02, the last 4 Iranian commandos consolidated along a starboard equipment rack cluster. Ammunition nearly expended, movement restricted by structure and encirclement, no extraction. They fired until their magazines ran dry. At 11:34:19, the final exchange ended. All 50 Iranian boarders were down. No surrender signals, no viable escape routes, no further resistance. The deck fell silent except for rotor wash overhead and the crackle of secondary fires. 11:34:43. 26 minutes after the first grappling hook struck steel, USS Porter was secure. Marine sweep teams began systematic clearance. Ladder wells, access hatches, storage lockers, overhangs, and deck-mounted systems inspected one by one. No assumption of finality without verification. At 11:35:27, Captain Mitchell transmitted confirmation. Boarding threat neutralized, ship secure, casualty assessment ongoing. Medical teams moved without delay. 19 American personnel had been killed during the initial assault phase. 43 were wounded, several critically. Stabilization began topside before evacuation to USS Baton's medical facilities. Victory did not erase loss. It confirmed survival. At 11:36, AH-1Z Vipers completed overwatch sweeps across the debris field. No hostile surface contacts remained operational. 22 Iranian vessels were destroyed or disabled. None had escaped. Below the surface, P-8 maritime patrol aircraft extended sonar coverage. No additional submarine contacts. No secondary torpedo launches. The assault had been comprehensive. So had the response. At 11:37, Fleet Command authorized calibrated retaliation against infrastructure directly linked to the boarding attempt. The authorization was procedural, not emotional. USS Baton launched a limited strike package, F/A-18S, armed with GBU-39 small-diameter bombs. Targets were restricted to identified Revolutionary Guard naval staging facilities and commando training compounds assessed as operational nodes for the attack. No civilian infrastructure targeted, no broad bombardment, precision only. Within the hour, 6 support sites were struck and rendered inoperable. The message was structured, not theatrical. Boarding an American warship was not symbolic. It triggered consequence. By 12:05, smoke still drifted from the wreckage surrounding USS Porter. The destroyer resumed controlled maneuvering, radar arrays recalibrated, Defensive systems reset to ready posture. Carrier strike group flight operations continued without withdrawal. The formation did not retreat, it tightened. Intelligence teams began exploitation of recovered equipment. AK-103 rifles, encrypted handheld radios, cutting torches, grappling assemblies. Serial numbers logged. Communications devices isolated for analysis. Every detail mattered. Because the event was not solely tactical, it was strategic. The Iranian plan had depended on surprise, proximity, and shock value. The intended outcome had been narrative dominance, a captured American destroyer in international waters. Instead, the documented result was containment within 26 minutes. 50 boarders dead, 22 boats destroyed, 6 support facilities struck, USS Porter operational. By mid-afternoon, the Strait of Hormuz appeared unchanged. Tankers resumed transit. Civilian radar feeds normalized. From a distance, no visible transformation. But inside regional command centers, calculations shifted. Seizing a U.S. warship required more than ropes and numbers. It required control of time. For 26 minutes, time belonged to the defenders. The final entry in USS Porter's operational log read, "Boarding attempt repelled. Vessel secure. Mission continues." No commentary followed. The clock had run. And it had not favored the attackers.